Hello, and welcome to Subfloor Stories, where we have conversations around faith and culture. I'm your host, Angie Ring. On today's podcast, we have one of my absolute favorite podcasters, Brandi Miller, from the podcast Reclaiming My Theology. I have learned so much from Brandi over the last few years, from dismantling white power structures to learning how to deconstruct the faith that you grew up with. And she touches on all of that here. I know you're going to enjoy this episode. Here we go. Well, hi, Brandi. Thanks so much for being on.
Of course, so glad to be here.
I'm so happy you said yes. I was trying a little bit. I was actually going to say this beforehand, but I started listening to you in 2020. And
Dang.
so when I asked you if you would be on and you're like, yeah, sure, I was like total fangirling. Like I messaged my spiritual director. He's the one that like first told me about your podcast. And I was like,
Hmm.
guess who's going to be on my podcast? Oh, so excited. So thank you.
Of
Thank you
course.
so
Of
much.
course.
So really why I asked you to be on is like I said, I love your podcast and I would just love to hear a little more about you. Um, I know that you grew up in church. If you wouldn't mind sharing just a little bit, like kind of where you started your
Mhm.
faith journey.
Yeah, so I didn't grow up in the church like Awana's Sunday school kind of growing up in church. I entered the church because my older sister started dating a Baptist pastor's son when I
Oh.
was 13 or 14. And so immediately she thought I was going to hell. And so she started bringing me to church, and I was a socially awkward kid who didn't have a lot of social skills. And so youth group was a really great place to make friends. And so I found that between the friendship making of a youth group setting and having a pretty traumatic and chaotic background in a lot of different ways, that church offered both community and structure in a way that my family of origin, despite really trying, just couldn't offer given our circumstances. And so being in a Western or Southern Baptist community, which is so high structure, at least theologically or ideologically speaking, gave me a lot of boundaries to my thought and internal world that I didn't have growing up.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I love thinking about it like you're kind of talking, are you familiar with like stages of faith?
Yes.
Like yeah. So it's like you're kind of starting at like you just start following God and it's like stage one, you like the structures, you need kind of the guardrails.
Yes.
So you continue going to church like through middle school, high school.
Yeah, I mean, it became kind of my whole world. Like, once I started going to church, I didn't stop. Like, at the first church I went to, I was like a 14-year-old janitor in the building to pay for youth group trips and was teaching Sunday school alongside 1 year short-term missionaries who were coming home for
Wow.
a year of reprieve or rest. I was at every Sunday service, every youth group service, every Wednesday night service. I was serving in everything. And so church became my entire world. And so because I grew up in the context that I did grow up in, theologically speaking, I came from a place where salvation was the primary after an afterlife view of salvation became everything. And so the type of urgency and importance
Mhm.
always being high felt like it was one of the major rudders of my life. Like it was the thing that shaped everything else, was how do I have spiritual conversations? How do I evangelize? How do I have a defense for my faith? I feel like I read the Bible and the Kingdom of the Cults at the same time, which is like a book of like why other religions are wrong. So I was trying to learn
Oh,
why I was
wow.
right and why other religions were wrong, and going to Creation
Yeah.
Fest and Spirit Northwest and wanting to produce Christian music. And so that carried me through really through the very beginning of my college experience.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you stuck with it all through college.
Mhm.
I'm just curious, during that time, were there any like questions kind of starting to form for you as far as looking forward into deconstruction, or were you just like 150% sold? Like you were in?
I was in. I think what happened was because of the framing in Western evangelical faith as truth as primary rather than God as primary, it's really easy to not have a significant relationship with God, but to feel very connected to things that feel like God. And so you can have the will of God without the
Wow.
character of God. You can have the work of God, you can center obedience, but never really have love. And I think it's not
Yeah.
that I didn't have love, but I think that those things, that it was secondary, that love was always interpreted through the lens of obedience. So if someone didn't
Yes.
obey, they were not worthy of love. Even if they were worthy of like the sacrifice of Jesus, they weren't worth the attention of Jesus or the attention of Jesus's people. And so through high school, while I had a diversity of friends and community, I never like really had the cognitive dissonance wasn't there because I was just like, oh, these people just need to get saved. So of course I'm in relationship with people who are not like me. It was when I went
Mm-hmm.
to college in 2008 that I came in as like literally would have identified with the Tea Party, like Tea Party
Oh,
Republican,
wow.
conservative Baptist Christian, and I went to a small private liberal arts college in Oregon that wasn't faith centered. Well, much to the chagrin of everybody in my church
Uh-oh.
who was like,
Yeah.
"Oh, you should be going to Master's College or Biola or Azusa Pacific. Like those are your options."
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I went to college and ended up in an InterVarsity Christian Fellowship chapter. And InterVarsity then I think is different than InterVarsity now in that it's become, as most evangelical collegiate movements have become, more conservative.
Mm-hmm.
But my chapter specifically, and being in the Pacific Northwest, was incredibly progressive. And so I encountered this group of like really racially diverse, gender and sexuality identification diverse, background, ecumenically diverse. It was an ecumenical space. And so I
Yeah.
was in this community that claimed that they could hear from God in real time. And I was like, you only have to hear from God through the Bible, guys. Like, I would say that like they there's a phrase I used back then that I can't remember. Oh, that you're like so woke that you've lost the gospel. Or like you're so loving that you've lost the God of love, or like just like kind
Yeah.
of aphorisms like that that would say,
Oh,
oh, you
yeah.
care so much about justice and this like hearing from God that it's so woo that doesn't mean anything. Like, what kind of foundation could you have? But it was through encountering that group of people who were incredibly patient with me and taught me how to actually read the Bible. Like I knew how to memorize the Bible and how to
Mm.
parrot what other people said about the Bible, but I didn't know how to read it. And I've been a pretty intellectually rigorous person for my whole life. And
Mhm.
so when I was taught new skills for how to read the Bible, it opened up everything for me and caused me at like 19 to question everything I thought I knew about faith.
Wonderful. So yeah, you're hitting kind of the proverbial wall. Like, wait, if this isn't 100% true, how can any of it be? Did you
Right.
hold to like the literal interpretation of the Bible, like 6,000 year old Earth and all of that?
Oh
Is
yeah,
it
yeah, yeah, yeah,
that?
for sure.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you had a full-on deconstruction experience.
Yeah, I mean, my freshman year of college in the summer, I worked at a creationism camp, like in like rural Colorado. Like I was like really, really in it. So
Were
really in
you
it.
like God, people who love God vote Republican, and like that's like how could anybody who's a Christian ever vote Democrat? Like
Exactly.
kind
It
of
was like,
all of
oh,
that.
Democrat equals evil equals godless equals
Yeah.
kill the family unit. If you kill the family unit, you kill the nation. If you kill the nation, you kill God's witness in the world.
Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah. Okay, so you start kind of getting into spaces where you start questioning. Did you ever completely lose your faith? Like, do you think there was
No.
any?
Sorry, I cut you off.
No, that's it. That's it. Yeah, go with that.
No, I really didn't. I think because I was involved in a Christian community that held me so well in my transformation
Yeah.
that it didn't really feel like deconstruction. And I was doing it like 8 years before people were really even talking about deconstruction, because I feel like that language in particular really happened around the first Trump administration
Yeah.
and around Black Lives Matter. And so
Mm,
because the deconstruction movement happened in that time, there wasn't really language or the same kind of language, even if there were people who were actually doing it for what we would call deconstruction now. And so for me, it was more, I think the language I generally use more than deconstruction is unlearning. That
yeah.
and it's part of why my work is around reclaiming, because it feels like there's things that I think are core to how and what my faith was, like a love for the Bible. And while my love for the Bible hasn't changed as a value, how I love the Bible has changed. And so
Mm,
I never really lost everything because I've held the value of prayer, but how I pray has changed. I hold the value for even like evangelism in some way, like letting people know that Jesus is good and available in their lives and accessible. I hold that really differently. And so
yeah.
for me, it wasn't like a total capsizing. Like I think people use the kind of pretty consistently use the metaphor of unraveling a ball of yarn. And the thing I don't like about the metaphor is that what people mean by that is that like something that was one structure is now completely unwound and is no good anymore. And I'm like, yeah, but the substance of the thing is the same. The shape of it is what becomes
Yeah.
different. And
Yeah.
so I think for me, that is true that even as I unwound, it wasn't that I was losing, I didn't throw the yarn into a fire. I just unwound it and have built something new out of it. And so I think the metaphor
Right.
is used poorly. And And there's a way to redeem that metaphor, even to say that, like, no, I didn't lose everything. I just built something new out of what I already had in me.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that it's a shame that deconstruction has become kind of a bad word in some Christian circles, like that it means you are like falling away or whatever, when in fact I think it is a healthy part of
Hmm.
faith. I mean, if
Yes.
we, again, like use stages of faith language, if we say it's stage one faith always,
Mhm.
right? We're not changing, we're not growing, we're not, or
Right.
evolving. That's another term that people will use,
Hmm.
I think though also what happens and why maybe it's become a bad word is that a lot of times people will start to like deconstruct and like question things, and they don't have a Christian community like you said that
Hmm.
you did. So you had these people there answering your questions, and you're able to kind of wrestle with these things and talk through things. And a lot of people don't. They're in
Right.
traditions where you start asking those questions, and that means, uh-oh, you're kind of,
Yes.
on a bad path. Well, then people just
Yeah.
leave church, so they do just unravel, and
Yes.
nothing is rebuilt because they don't have anyone around them. That's what
Right.
I'm just kind of seeing a lot. Anyway, that was a little tangent about
Yeah, no,
deconstruction.
totally.
But
No, that totally makes
yeah,
sense.
it's just a shame that more people aren't able to stay in Christian community and wrestle kind of around some of these topics.
Right. And that's because there are structures in most Christian communities that create us and them on the basis of ideological purity. And so if you move away from ideological purity,
Exactly.
you are moving backwards, you're on the slippery slope, and you are framed as compromising the integrity of everyone else's faith as well. Like if one person falls away, then they all fall away. And there's like weird Bible work that people do around that to say that
Yeah.
like when one person follows this thing, like then everybody
Yeah.
goes, and then we point to the culture, quote unquote, the culture at large and say, well, this is what happens when people fall away.
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
the deconstruction space can feel really difficult because it is an undoing of every structure that creates stability, certainty, and attendance in most church communities. And so if you seem
Exactly.
ideologically wishy-washy on something, then it seems like you are not, quote unquote, Bible believing, or that you don't have reverence for the scriptures, that if you lose the idea of inerrancy, that you hate the Bible. And so the lack of
Yes.
nuance in those spaces is built into the structures such as to keep them secure, which I understand and I don't really fault them for, but it does create a context in which it is easy to cast people out of communities or families based on identity politics or whatever, because truth matters more than people do.
Yeah. Yes. And I love that you said that's what keeps attendance also, like that there is something, and I do still love the church. There are amazing things that the church does. I think I'm just kind of
Mhm.
also to a point to see maybe some of the negative things that
Totally.
happen. But yeah, I mean, if someone or people start questioning the systems of the church itself, you kind of become a threat
Yep.
to the existence of that entity,
Yep.
right? To
Totally.
people attending, to people tithing, to all of those things. I remember years ago when I was kind of wrestling with like the LGBTQ plus issue, because I was like, I just don't see how it's a bad thing. And I was talking to one of my pastors at the time,
Hmm.
and he was like, well, if you're affirming, you just can't be an evangelical anymore. And I was like, oh, okay. Like there was just such a difference in how he interpreted that sentence and how
Yes.
I received it, because he said it like, oh, that would be the worst thing. But then, of
Yeah.
course, I'm like, well, what, but that's just another example of the structure itself. You
Yes.
have to kind of, run within those walls. So,
Yes.
okay, so you're in college, and you thankfully have people around you
Hmm.
who yeah, are talking you through these things. And how did your relationship stay with the folks that like, did you say it was your sister who first started taking you
Hmm.
to church? Like with the people who were from your ex tradition that you were kind of growing out of?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my friendships didn't really change that much. Like my peer level, like horizontal relationships or my relationship with my family didn't really change because we were all millennials and we were like in like right in the middle of millennials. Like I was born in 1990. And so We're like
Okay.
squarely in this generation of people who experienced so much chaos externally and who have a lot more ideological looseness around what we believe the world is like because the world has changed so rapidly around us. And
Yeah.
so a lot of my friends were like having sex before they were married, but they were still going to church. They were questioning their faith. They were stopping going to church at all, as much to like their family's shame. And it wasn't to say that they weren't still interested in faith things, but they just weren't interested in the same way. Like some of them went off and got early
Right.
married to partners that their parents disliked. And so I think a lot of their relationship was more tied to their parental connection to the church than it was to their own
Hmm.
personal relationship with God. And so that didn't really change. But the problem for me was specifically that I was heavily involved in the two churches. So I moved partway through high school and I was heavily involved in both really conservative churches. And I went into ministry. And so after college. And so they were super proud of me for being like the one who did it, like the one who went to a liberal school, but like then worked for a Christian ministry and who was going on mission for God. And they're like, we did it. We saved the youth from dying in a liberal hellhole, which just did not end up being true.
Yeah.
And so the main conflict I ended up having was when I started raising ministry support for my work with InterVarsity. I
Mm.
was fundraising, people were giving money, and then they would see that I was like starting a Black student chapter or like a Bible study for queer students, or that we were singing in different languages, or that we were interpreting the Bible differently, or that students were invited to discover the Bible, not just have clarity given to them about the Bible. And it was in those moments that I started hearing what I think are now kind of the more what we would call DEI now, which was, or what we would call DEI now, which was critical race theory, which was woke, which was like Black Lives Matter, which was, it just feels like the language is changing, but the concept is still just straightforward anti-Blackness. And so,
Yes.
and homophobia. And so
Mhm.
I got early versions of that where people were withdrawing their ministry support because we weren't centering the gospel anymore and we were just like centering all this like political stuff, and that language of political was something that drew my community out even though they were some of the most political people I knew. They just wouldn't
Yeah.
admit it because it was so heavily housed in within their theological experience.
Yes. I love that political, like you're getting political, only it's only said from people who are the opposite side of political
Hmm.
that they view you as.
Yes.
Right? Like
Yes.
my husband and I pastored a small church for a few years, and if we would say something about immigrants or whatever, we were getting too political. But of course, that only comes from conservative people who don't
Right.
want to hear about any black or brown people
Hmm.
for them. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I can totally see that. You start experiencing it when you're trying to kind of fundraise and gain support and things like that. But I'm still amazed that you kept your faith through all of this.
Mm.
Like this is a massive, and I know that you like work in this arena, like you've heard a million stories of people who have kind of went through
Mhm.
this, but from my experience, you seem a little like the outlier. From the
Mhm.
people's stories that I hear so frequently, they end up deconstructing and that's where they stop.
Right.
Is that your experience, or do you feel like you're the outlier? Or I don't know, you probably don't think of yourself that way.
I don't know if like I don't think I consider myself an outlier like in some positive like ahead of a curve sense, but more so in a as no matter how much I deconstruct my faith or no matter how progressive I become, there's some just basic experiences of and I use this language really carefully because I don't believe it in the same way that I was taught it, but of the sovereignty of God in my life. So
Mm,
these moments where God has intervened or showed up in my life in ways that I can't deny. And so, no matter
yeah.
how logical, scientific, intellectual, academic I become, there are experiences and stories that I have of my own life and people in my life that I can't let go of. And so, the
Yes.
baseline, like, is there a God or do I like want to follow Jesus? Like, those aren't even really questions I've asked because, again, I'll quote a white man, but like, I think Dallas Willard was asked, like, how do you know you're following Jesus? And his response is the people have tested the words of Jesus and found them to be true. And I think that for me, I have tested the words of Jesus for a really long time and have found them to be true. So even in seasons of my life where I'm not like giving in the same way, praying in the same way, reading the Bible in the same way, having Christian community in the same way, the baseline experiences I've had, supernatural and very ordinary experiences of the presence of God in my life, and the love for the way of Jesus outside of all of the bullshit. I don't know if you cuss on
Hmm.
this podcast.
Oh
Feels
yeah,
like
you can
it,
cuss.
feels like it has carried me a really long way. And I think that when
Yes.
we don't have good language or awareness of these ordinary experiences of encountering the Holy Spirit or experiencing the love of God in our lives, it's easier to become unhooked. And so if our sense of the love of God is only ideological, it makes sense that we would float away. And if our sense of
Yes.
God's love is only connected to other people telling us something is good news, not actually experiencing or being able to interpret our own lives as good news, then of course we're going to capsize in on ourselves like dying stars. Like we're going to have
Right.
major issues. And so for me, I don't know that I consider my ideology an outlier, but I think my experience of being able to hold on to the love and presence of God and the way of Jesus in the midst of it maybe is slightly unique, maybe just to
Yeah.
who I am as a person.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I guess outlier might not have been the best language. I was thinking maybe just in the minority percentage wise is
Yeah,
probably the best way to say that.
right.
But I was reading something by Brian Zahnd recently, and he says what you just said. He says, I believe in the person of Jesus because I've experienced the person of
Mhm.
Jesus.
Yeah,
And I mean, that's, essentially what you were saying. It's like, yeah, like I still believe in God because I have experienced God. It's
right.
all of the other shit, as you said, that
Yeah,
can kind of, crumble
yeah.
and fall away because a lot of that is man-made.
Yes. The other thing I'll say too that maybe is different is that is a matter of calling. Like I experienced the calling on my life as to be a person who does full-time vocational ministry for at least the foreseeable future. And
Yeah.
I've been in full-time vocational ministry since I was 21 or 22. And that, I'm well over a decade into ministry, into full-time faith life as my experience. And a
Yeah.
lot of my goals and aspirations feel like they're related to that calling and to that experience. And so I think for many folks who don't experience faith as their primary vocational calling, it's
Yeah.
easier to lose some of the other pieces. Because for me, like my whole sense of self, and I don't even mean this in like a, I think there's a way to interpret this as a post deconstruction evangelical or post deconstruction person of faith as culty, but it's not. I just think that like my who I am is related to all of this stuff, and so
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
continue working through this and to wrestle hard through these issues is a matter of my whole life. And so I think for people who for whom that is not true, it's way harder to hold on because you may not
Well,
feel
that's a
called
really
to the
good
same
point.
things or feel called to ministry or feel called to faith formation. And if your vocation is outside of that, then I don't know why you would do as much as I've had to do to hold on in the way that I have.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I guess I haven't thought of it in that context at all. I mean, a lot of folks who vocationally, if they're, I don't know, in like banking or,
Yeah,
whatever, they don't have as much drive there to kind of figure it
yeah,
out, so to
yeah,
speak, you
yeah. And
know?
time. Like
Yeah,
this
they're
stuff
not, I
takes a
mean, they're not
lot of
knee deep
time.
in it at all
Yes.
times. So,
Yes.
yeah.
And there's not space. Like I think that we have to have enough humility to say, like for people who are coming from my space, I work
Yes.
full time at a church, to say that the average person does not have the same amount of time that I do to rigorously comb through books or history or
Yeah.
sit in silent prayer or have enough space internally. Like I'm an engaged, childless ministry worker. I have time and space in my life that people with kids, that people with different jobs, that people with more chaotic life circumstances do not have the capacity to do. And I think
Sure.
one of the things that people in ministry, particularly, I would say white male pastors, because I think this is true, do is assume that everyone has the same capacity for what they would call faithfulness as they do. That
Yes.
when they say, I sit in my den and study at 5 o'clock in the morning every day, and that's how I'm faithful to God. I'm like, you get paid to do that. Like
Yeah, I was
literally
gonna say the
your
same thing.
job is to read the Bible and to pray. Like
Yes.
it is such a nonsensical expression of
Yes.
faithfulness to people who live their lives outside of full-time ministry work. And so I think that it is deeply unfair for pastors to only use their own experiences as a gauge of faithfulness and development. And so I'm really careful about that in my own work to say, there's
Yeah.
a reason I do the work I do, and it's to make this kind of stuff more accessible for a person who can't go read 6 books to get the footnotes on how to read
Right.
womanist theology appropriately. Like I can
Right.
express that in an hour and a half rather than doing that in 30 hours of reading. And so I think the accessibility of information also makes deconstruction really hard because once you start, there's
Yeah.
so many things to learn and unlearn. And I just wish that people had enough humility to say, on the progressive side, this takes a lot more work than a lot of us are able to do, even if we were willing to do it. And I think that willingness and ability get conflated, and that's really unfortunate.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a really good point too. Yeah, thanks for saying that too. You're making me think of a lot of this in like a different light. Like you, just to go back really quickly, you've given me so much language around these things. It's just, I don't know. I really appreciate you.
Mm,
I really appreciate the work that you do.
yeah, of
So I
course.
just wanted to throw that in there because even
Of
just in
course.
this, some of the things you're saying, I'm like, oh, yeah, that's a really good point.
Mm,
I mean, even just like, white male leaders encouraging folks to spend the time that they do, which
mhm,
seems like a tiny thing, but how that becomes this entire what do I want to say, like stumbling block to the whole church
mhm.
because,
Yes.
well, I'm a single mom and I'm up at 5 a.m. like nursing, but like
Yep.
I'm just like people are walking around flogging themselves because I'm
Yep.
not reading as much as Pastor Rick or.
Yep. Totally.
Yeah.
And it's to the, I think it just feels frustrating because it neglects the other parts of faith formation that most of us
Mm.
primarily experience the most joy in. Because we will prioritize prayer and Bible reading over community, or we will decry like it's part
Yes.
of why I stay in the book of Luke as my primary text for my life, is because Jesus spends most of his time with his disciples walking, eating and drinking, and being in relationship with people who aren't like them. And if those
Yes.
values get neglected in lieu of just reading the Bible and just worshiping and just praying, then the worship and prayer and Bible reading do very little to make you a person who actually lives the way of Jesus, but you know the way of Jesus and can become self-righteous about the way of Jesus rather
Yes.
than humble in living it. Because I think that those things, eating and walking, this like slow movement and being with people who
Mm.
aren't like us, will force us into humility. And it's part of what the disciples struggle with through all of Jesus's teachings is, hey, can we call fire down on those people? And Jesus is like, oh, what are you talking about? Like, of course you
Chill
cannot do that.
out.
Or like, which one of us is going to be the greatest in the kingdom? And Jesus has to keep repeating these sentiments about like the greatest among you will be the least. You will be a servant. Like you're going to wash each other's feet. You're going to be for each other. You're going to go out of your way to engage with people who wouldn't have come to you. You're going to go offer good
Mm.
news to people who will reject you. And that type of humility, I don't think comes from just willing yourself to humility through looking at Jesus and staring at Jesus. It comes through knowing
Yeah.
Jesus with other people and in the context of the everyday life in which the divine is found. And so I think that
Yeah.
not only is the study, at 5 in the morning inaccessible to most people for their lives, it is a neglecting of some of the core tenets of what it means to follow Jesus. And if people don't believe me, you can just go read Acts and see what they do. They're praying
Yeah.
and worshiping, but they're also gathering together and eating and journeying and doing justice. And those things are what create a holistic experience of faith rather than a siloed heart and mind faith that has nothing to do with the body. And so it makes sense that we would become disembodied and not interested in the quote unquote political, as you were saying before, when that is our foundational truth.
Yes. Absolutely. That is, yeah. And not to mention, that's where we're formed most is when we're in community and we're rubbing
Yes.
shoulders with people who, like you said, aren't like us, or sometimes that we don't, that annoy us, that
Oh, for sure.
whatever it is, like,
Yep.
oh gosh, Cindy's group again, like, or whatever
Yes.
it is. I don't know why it has to be Cindy, but it just sounded appropriate. But I mean, that's when we're formed because, like, when we're just reading, we're not challenged at all, really. When we're in community, when we're around people that aren't like us and people that, sometimes we don't want to be around, that's when our edges start getting softened. And I think we're able to see Jesus more fully.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
wonderful. So what kind of faith tradition are you part of nowadays?
I am a part of a recently non-denominational because we disaffiliated because of being affirming church. So I guess
Okay.
I would consider myself, I don't know. I think I'd probably just call myself a follower of Jesus right now. I'm not connected to
Yeah.
currently connected to a tradition, but I've been deeply shaped by Black womanist traditions, so womanist traditions. I've been deeply shaped by my Baptist roots that gave me a love for the Bible that I have not
Mm-hmm.
lost. I've been deeply shaped by House of Prayer traditions or like
Mm.
Vineyard or
Yeah.
Foursquare traditions that have taught
Mm-hmm.
me, or like on the like on in Black spaces like AME churches that have taught
Mm-hmm.
me in awareness and love for the Holy Spirit. So I think I have more of like an ecumenical
Yeah.
faith in and of myself rather than as a part of a collective, but that is expressed in a non-denominational church right now.
Okay, wonderful. Would you mind, you've mentioned a couple times about, and I haven't heard this language, like womanist traditions, or
Mhm.
can you just flesh that out for me a little bit?
Yeah, womanism is rooted in Alice Walker's language of a womanist, where she's talking about ideologies or ways of knowing that are not like purple or white, but they're lavender. They like sit in them this middle space. And she's using
Mm,
that to talk about a description to describe theology or ideology or worldview, but we'll call it theology. Womanist theology would be, womanism in theology. Um,
hmm
theology through a Black woman's perspective. And so
mm.
it takes the lived experiences of Black women and reads them in and out of the scriptures. And so, like when you read the
Wow.
story, say, of Hagar as an enslaved woman who is manipulated by a master and then sent off, and we read our own experiences into that, we're going to read the Bible differently than a man who's just like, oh, Hagar was so
Mm.
faithful and God blessed her, but then like not her
Yeah.
kids and like not Islam and all that, and so
Mhm.
it's just a way, it's a lens for an intentional lens for reading scripture that says, here is the lens we are reading from. Because I think part of what happens in white theology specifically is that it assumes that it is theology, it's just truth, rather than saying this is a
Yes.
lens that we are bringing to the scriptures that is then forming how we read,
Mm.
what we read into and what we read out of it, and how we read ourselves into a text that actually wasn't written for white folks
Yes.
straight up, and that we are sojourners into and out of. And so womanism is a way of reading from a Black woman's perspective that opens up an intentionally uh, specific lens to understand the image of God through the work of Black women.
Fascinating. So there, I mean, are there like books written
Oh, tons.
about like,
Yes.
okay, yeah, I mean, I
I would
guess,
I would
go
read
ahead.
Katie Cannon's Katie Cannon writes a book on womanism that's really wonderful. Dr. Will Gaffney writes a book called Womanist Midrash, which is was deeply foundational and formative for me in learning womanism. She is so smart, and she takes a womanist lens through reading between the lines of scripture to fill in the stories of what stories are not being told. And so yeah, Katie Cannon, Dr. Will Gaffney are really good starting points for talking about womanism.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm
Of
so glad
course,
you do as much reading as you do because then you can share all of your resources with us.
there's so many.
Yeah, there really are. There really are. Well, great. So that's kind of your arc
Mhm.
of deconstruction, reconstruction. Do you believe that we are always deconstructing and reconstructing? Or do you believe it's just kind of this one big experience? What's kind of your take on just the process of it? Is that a
You
weird
know,
question?
no, it's not a weird
This
question.
is the way my mind works.
No, it's not a weird question at all. I think where I get stuck, and it's not a bad thing. It's that I think that the Bible actually gives us really good language for this, and deconstruction isn't that language, and so it's hard for
Yes.
me to take.
Sorry, I keep using the language.
No, it's okay. I don't think it's bad. I speak the language of deconstruction fluently,
Yeah, yeah,
and I
yeah.
think because it's not the language I use for myself personally,
hmm
I can get a little stuck in the semantics of what we are or are not saying. And because I am a person for whom language is super important, and not because it's right, just because it helps me to understand the world,
Yeah.
I become more specific, and it can make things nuanced in a way that almost means nothing. And so I understand that as a weakness of my own work, but also where I can find a lot of clarity. And so for me, I think there is this language in the scriptures of conversion that I think is more helpful to me than deconstruction, because conversion assumes that there is a way of being that you are changing from and to. And deconstruction just
Mm.
gives you distance away from. So deconstruction says I'm moving from one thing into I'm breaking down the bricks of the house, and then I'm left in the middle of a house that is completely in shambles with nothing to say, where I'm just
Okay.
looking around at the rubble. And I think it's what deconstruction oriented people do so poorly and why it's such a can feel very douchey in its language is
Yeah.
because you just like stare and scream at what is terrible and you never like speak to what is, or it's really difficult to move from that space. It's
Mm,
so easy to critique and be critical of things without being constructive. And so I think the
yeah.
scriptures use this language of conversion and invite people into a process of being constantly converted toward the way of Jesus that says, there's this thing that I do, there's this way that I am, there's this thing that I believe, and there is a turn that I can make to change the trajectory of how I am in the world. Even
Mm,
small, like, because I think about trajectory, right? I think about it in like clock language, right? If I am pointed straight at 12 o'clock and I keep going in that direction, I keep going in that direction. But if I shift to the 1 o'clock angle and I keep moving, if I take that angle out far enough, I will land far, far away from that 12 o'clock destination. And
mm,
so I think about how small bits of conversion move us farther away from the things that are problematic or difficult or immoral, wrong, sinful, whatever language you want to use. And so the constant language of conversion or being converted toward the way of Jesus is just ticking that clock angle different directions until we find ourselves in a completely different place. And so for me,
okay.
a lot of the work is saying, okay, there's this part of my life around generosity where I need to be converted to the way of Jesus. And in this season of my life, with this job I have and with this income I have, that conversion looks like this. Later in my
Mm,
life, I will be constantly converting that particular value. And so I think about my faith in terms of values that are being ever converted in my changing life stages toward the way of Jesus. And it allows me as I grow and change to let different spiritual disciplines and practices shape my life in different ways. And so, where I was doing like intense listening prayer in my 20s, now I'm doing a lot more contemplative things like walking the labyrinth or journaling feel like really significant ones for me now. And that's not a regression of my faith, it's a conversion of my faith in this season of my life. And so, if we can see
great.
ourselves as constantly converting, we can always be questioning how the words of Jesus will hit us in different ways in different seasons of our life and let that be okay. And it pushes back against this idea that there is some objective truth that should be navigating and
Mm,
negotiating every aspect of our lives rather
right.
than saying, well, no, like the creation is always unfolding. We as humans are always unfolding. We are adjusting to an imperfect world constantly. And that means the way that we convert to the way of Jesus in an ever complicated world will be different than it was a year ago, a day ago, 10 years
Sure.
ago, three administrations ago, all of that.
I love that language. I've not heard the language of conversion around this. And I mean, you're obviously really comfortable with it, so you're pretty used to it, but I might adopt that. Can I start
Oh,
using
oh,
that
of course.
language?
I think it's just helpful
But I
because it
do,
says that you
yeah, I
don't have to do
agree.
everything all at once.
Yeah. And conversion, like you said, it does feel less finite.
Mhm,
It's more fluid. It's more,
mhm.
just kind of ever
Yes,
changing. So I like that. Well, wonderful. Thank you for sharing all of
of
that.
course.
We have a few minutes. You had touched on like, um, you know, what it means now or in 5 years or whatever to be experiencing Jesus in our context. And I don't know if you're familiar, but our political tensions are running a little high right now.
Mm.
You've maybe not seen that, but I can fill you in if you want me to.
It's pretty bad. It's really
But
bad out here.
it's really bad out here. Oh yeah. So what as someone who is knee deep in church, as someone who has probably done a just an astronomical amount of research on church history, but also the history of our country even. What are your feelings on just present day United States, present day church in the United
Mhm.
States? That's a hugely open-ended question. If you need me to be more specific, I will, but I'm going to guess you don't.
Well, I spend a good majority of my time thinking about national American politics. As much as I love theology, my last like 6 years have been maybe like chest deep in the intricacies of our national political system. And so
Mm,
in this moment, one, because I am Black, and two, because I am studied, I am not surprised by what is happening right now. I
yes.
am, however, deeply concerned and grieved. And it gets
Mm.
complicated because when we start to talk about these issues, what we end up doing is we talk about democracy and faithfulness to Jesus as though they're the same thing. And I don't think that's necessarily true, even though I believe in a democratic system. And the convolution of these ideas makes everything really, really difficult to hang on to. And so for me right now, the way that I'm thinking about it is that I mean, I don't know if you've seen the stuff floating around about the 3.5% rule, but it's essentially the idea that if 3.5% of a population resists consistently, it creates
Mm.
social change and resistance to fascism. And so,
Right.
for me in my own life, the thing I'm thinking about is how can I be a part of a 3.5% of people who resist
Mm.
consistently and who resist not just in protest or like showing up in the streets, but in maybe lifelong boycotts of places, in pushback in town halls, of consistent local voting, of building coalitions and communities of people who write letters, who deeply uh, disgruntle my elected representatives, who are faithful not just in ideological purity, but in politics as a more of a bus stop than it is a destination. That we're trying to get with our politics, not to our end goal, because our politicians will never get us there in the United States,
Right.
but we are trying to move toward a closer stop in it.
Hmm.
And every political action we take can be seen as moving forward in the bus stop. And I think that a lot of our progressive politics right now are about trying to get to the end goal without taking the stops along the way, or saying that
Mm.
we just have to burn the whole thing down or have a revolution. I'm like, yes, we need to be revolutionary. We have to have a revolution. But that generally won't come from just like starting the buildings all on fire. It will come through the everyday faithfulness of 3.5% of people who choose to show up and to fight well within their churches and their communities, who
Yes.
refuse to give up the humanity of their actual neighbors in lieu of fighting an orange man who doesn't give a shit about them. Like
Hmm.
that everyday work of tackling issues around houselessness or housing insecurity, of hunger in
Yeah.
our communities,
Yeah.
are the things that give us the political wheels to actually do the national work. And so I think starting at the national is my temptation, but it isn't a good idea.
Yeah.
Starting locally and with how we spend our money and how we make adjustments in the small things and believing that those small things can matter is how we create revolutionary postures. We won't all be the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, the Black Panthers. We won't all be those people in the world,
Yeah.
but we can be people who push, who make people really uncomfortable
Mm.
in their oppressive politics, who make it financially unfeasible or untenable for people to continue to do what they do, who undermine and make fun of power mongers for what they are. Because if there's one thing that Donald Trump and Elon Musk hate more than anything, it's being made fun of.
Oh, yeah.
And so we make fun of them. We
Oh,
we tap at their egos. We
yeah.
fight against the things that make them money. We make them seem weak and small because they are. And we do that in small ways throughout time
Hmm.
that create a difference. And we've seen it work already in this administration. So many of the things that they've tried to do, we have fought effectively in the legal system, but also just in the kind of the court of public shame.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I have no problem shaming the devil, and I will do it
Hmm.
over and over again. If the
Hmm.
enemy seeks to steal, kill, and destroy, and we are watching an administration steal, kill, and destroy, that is the Antichrist, that is the devil. And I will fight that tooth and nail in small ways in my community and faithfully in large ways when I need to.
Yes. I need to take my microphone off and just drop it.
Please don't for the sake of your work.
I know, I know. Yes, yes. So be part of the 3%. Those are our
Mhm.
marching orders.
Yep.
And make change where we can, which, by the way, I know that you're pretty socially active, so I'm sure that you've probably kept up with some of the boycotts that are going on right now. There is there are tremendous results from
Yes.
like Target, Amazon, Tesla. I
Yep.
mean, the people are coming
Yes.
together
Yes.
and it really hitting them where it hurts.
Yes. Which is also wild to me, just as an aside, that people are so greedy that, like Tesla, right, that Elon Musk, who is the richest man on earth, still is affected by a reduction in his income.
Yeah,
And it's just
that's
emotional. It is just
wild.
emotional, pitiful weakness. The
Yes.
most powerful people in the world. And if that works, we gonna keep doing that because it was just ridiculous. It's so embarrassing for them. I do not understand how they are not
Like
embarrassed.
I know, I agree. You have enough money to live beyond comfortably for thousands of lifetimes,
Yes.
and it affects you that your
Yes.
stock's going down.
Yep.
And it's never in your life or your children's or your grandchildren's lives will they feel
No.
like seriously, what's happening?
Nope.
That loss. But it does still, I agree with you. It is wild to me.
Yep.
How greedy do you have to be?
Yep.
That
It's pitiful.
that's the thing. Yeah. And I also think that if I may talk about whiteness for half a
Hmm.
second,
Of
it's
course.
also a testament to the white male spirit and ego because these are all white men.
Hmm.
Every single one of them that we're talking about, all of these billionaires, um, it it is it is a testament to the desire for whiteness to stay in control
Yeah.
and the greed. So
Hmm.
whiteness and greed, they're two really strong power players to
Yes.
that you because you're yeah, that there's a lack of formation in their egos because they've never had to experience
Yep.
pain.
Yep.
And so they just have to keep winning, right?
Yep.
To prove to themselves that they are who they are. Sorry, that was a little
Yep.
tangent.
Nope. It's entirely true.
Yeah,
Like for how powerful whiteness is, it is the weakest willed, egoed,
1000%.
deformational ideology that there is on this earth, I think.
Because we have not been formed in those struggles.
Nope.
I think that's I was just talking to a black friend of mine, and I think that's one of the reasons that this last election and what's happened since has been so hard for white progressives because I mean black people I'm not going to presume to know what black people are feeling,
Right.
but logically black people have struggled a hell of a lot more. I mean,
Yes.
I think that most black people are like, yeah, this sucks, but like we didn't expect our government to do anything right anyway,
Right. Right.
right? Because Black people are used to being let down. They don't
Yep.
have the power structures, the power systems in place,
Right.
right?
Right.
White people do. And so I think that's one of the reasons it's so hard for white progressives right now, because
Yep.
it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You mean we're on the bottom end of this thing?
Yep.
How has this happened?
Yep. Yep. And whiteness relies on idealism, on idealistic
Mm.
mythological structures of what things can be. And so I think when white
Oh,
progressives are
wow.
disappointed, they become insufferably weak. Like, give
Mm.
up, go sit in like a gutter somewhere and act like the whole world is
Right.
over when most of us just have to survive. Most of us in the global majority have to
Yes.
survive the implications of white political action all the time. And so I think
Yes.
the lack of inner resolve and inner depth and inner strength of white folks is always apparent to me after elections where white progressives are disappointed. It ends up being a lot of screaming
Yeah.
into the void, but giving up any kind
Mhm.
of political responsibility, and that is nonsense.
Yes, preach. It's funny, well, it won't shock you, but as a white woman, this is the first one I've noticed.
Yep.
This is the first time
Mhm.
that I've really started having kind of this worldview where it's like, I mean, I've always known that we have massive issues.
Yeah.
I just didn't know this was one of them. I have not
Yeah.
seen, and I'm probably around more white progressives in my life now than I ever have been
Right, right.
historically. And so that's some of it too, is that I just kind of see the
Um,
impact on that group more than normal. But
yes,
yeah, thanks for talking through that with me
of course.
too.
And I think like maybe the last thing I'll say about it is that part of what is difficult about this moment is that to do effective political coalition building, we have to be willing to have nets that are big enough to catch every person who falls out during this administration. I think
Mm,
practically speaking, we will have a second wave of religious deconstruction as people wake up to how horrific these policies are, or people who
oh my
are aging
God.
into their own
Mm,
ideological worldviews who will say, holy shit, this is like way worse than I thought it was.
yes.
And the problem with white progressives is often that white progressives want to be saved but don't want to save, want to be people who act like they've always been saved and always been woke without creating structures to pull in people, like to build a safety net or a catch
Yes.
net for people who are falling out in this season. And it is the work of white progressives to say, I was helped through this moment in my own life, and that doesn't make me better than the people who haven't come to where I am. Like, it's not suddenly a hall
Yes.
pass away from doing the work that other people did for y'all to catch
Hmm.
people in this season. And I think the best thing that white progressives can do is to catch white people who are falling out right now, who are
Oh, that's
open
so
and
good.
soft to ideological change. And if they can't do that, instead just like cozy up to people of color and act like being close to people of color is doing the work, that's nonsense. It is the work, the hard work of saying, who are my family and friends and community members and church going members
Yes.
and folks who are showing signs of cracks right now, and how can I be a person who does for them what other people did for me?
Oh, I love that. I love that. Do we, just a quick clarification, do we have to catch all white people? Because there's
I
some I
don't
don't want to catch.
I think
That's a
if people are
terrible joke.
it's
Sorry.
fair. I mean it's a fair question. And I think that that's part of what the issue is that we ping pong between extremes.
We
We
do,
go in
yeah.
faith from one fundamentalism to another, from
Yes.
evangelical conservative to progressive fundamentalism, and we
Mm,
go from, oh, I can't say, like, I got to change everyone's mind to I can't change anyone's mind. And I think it's somewhere in the middle. I think
yeah.
that if people do not want to hear, it's we can use Jesus metaphors. If people's hearts are too hard,
Yes.
we don't
Right.
keep doing the thing, but we don't know how hard people's hearts are until we show up to Pharaoh 5 times or 8 times or 9 times.
Yeah.
And I think that white people are quick to give up when their feelings are hurt about one thing, or when they feel like
Yeah.
they've lost like one bit of clout or ego or emotional
Hmm.
well-being or whatever. And I think that I always tell white people, you need to try harder than you think you do, but not as hard as people would tell you you do. Like,
Mm, yeah.
if your grandpa is like the most racist MF in the world, like, and he's not going to change, then that's not a good use of your energy. The best use
Yeah.
of your energy, the limited finite energy you have, is on people who want to be in conversation, who are soft and willing to change, who are asking questions, who are needing
Yes.
people to show up. It is in the moments that you need to be brave to interrupt issues, knowing that someone might be shifted in the interruption of injustice that's happening in real time. So I think for a lot of white folks, it's about bravery and emotional capacity management rather than trying to save every person.
Yes. I love that. Also, thanks for that pass.
Yeah, it's not for every. The thing I say
I
for
know,
my
just
about
being
my
a
church is
jerk.
like, our church is for everyone, but it's not for everyone. Like,
Yes.
we have open
Yes,
space for
exactly.
whoever we would catch, but you may come in and really be like, this is not for me.
Yes. All right, let's kind of come in for a landing. I want to hear two things. First, tell me what your hope for the church is in this season, despite
Mhm,
very much polarization. And then I want you to just have the ability to plug whatever you want to plug.
mhm. I'm in a church that I love. I'm in a church that is doing amazing things, that has chosen the hard work of changing as a community in public in real time.
Mm,
And what I am finding is that even though people are reducing in their church going, in their desire to engage with faith because of the horrendous, like brutally violent, what I'll call witness of the evangelical church, people still long for spirituality in their lives. And when people
yes.
encounter authentic spirituality that actually is good news, that you just have to convince people is good news, those groups of people are powerful to come together to do good work. So as I watch my church vote or create space for formerly incarcerated people to share their stories and to do systemic work around those issues, when I see
Yes.
us feeding people and clothing people in our neighborhood, in our community, when I see us choosing to letter write and to fight for affordable housing, it reminds me that the church is not meant just to be a refuge in and of itself, but is meant to be a catalytic space where healed people go and heal the
Yes.
world. And I still believe in that mission. And so I think if healed people come
Amen.
and find belonging and space together, that it can make all of the difference. That being said, if people are in the Seattle area at all, Quest Church, great spot. Love that community. It is a wonderful space that is available in person and online if people just want to hear an increasingly non-hierarchical community figuring out how to follow Jesus in our context. We're doing that. And then I have a podcast that you've mentioned, Reclaiming My Theology, that seeks to take our theology back from ideas and systems that oppress. We're currently in a series on empire. It's a little bit slow on the rollout, but we are doing it and trying to figure out ways over the next really year and a half before midterm elections happen to create more theological and ideological clarity around what it means to resist empire in this season, in ourselves and in our communities and lives.
Amazing. And I can second her plug for her podcast. If anyone is interested in really any of the topics that she touched on, check it out. I absolutely love it.
It's very
Well,
kind.
Brandi, thank you. This
Of
is
course.
this is so kind of you to just generously spend time with me, with us, and
Of
just be
course.
willing to do this when you just got a random email from me.
Of course. It's within my value, so I will do it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Not a problem.
Thank you for listening. All aspects of this podcast were produced by me, Angie Ring, with overwhelming support and ongoing teaching by my son, Jairus. The song you hear is titled Death Defying Joy by the artist Andy Squires. You can find his music at Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. Check him out. See you next time.
Somewhere on the altar of broken dreams and shattered love, a burden of your mercy runs like a river on the vine. And everything I used to know is a table you turned over, so my maker